Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. I'm actually extremely excited to have with me Mark Hemingway, who is co-author with his wife, the Molly Hemingway, former You're Welcome guest. The book is called Rigged, and it's about the 2020 election. And I read the book, I learned a lot, and I'm really excited to dive into this because what we're told by the corporate press is this election was the most above board. No votes were stolen, so on and so forth, and there were no irregularities and all this nonsense. What you broke down in this book isn't some sort of ballot stuffing thing that night. The point you and Molly made is there were very many mechanisms put into place throughout 2020 and even previously to force an outcome preferable to the Democratic Party. In effect, they weren't breaking the rules, but they were changing the rules in order to exploit the vote. And this is something one would expect both political parties to do. But for some reason, the Republicans have historically not been something enough to do it to their advantage. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate summation. I mean, it's twofold. One is to just explain to people that had doubts about what happened with the election. One, you're not wrong to be concerned about all the crazy stuff that happened. An election in the middle of the pandemic and riots and media gaslighting and all these other things. But also secondarily, post-election, of course, there were a lot of crazy conspiracies out there spinning around. Partly because people were so gaslighted by all this stuff, and the erosion of trust in the major media, deservedly so. Made it so a lot of people were casting about for explanations for how things happened that weren't always above board and conspiratorial. But as you pointed out, I mean, like this stuff all happened out in the open. Some of the most egregious and unbelievably unfair and unconscionable things that happened were perfectly legal. And this kind of spells out sort of the narrative of an entire campaign of this stuff.
Uh, there was one, Boss Tweed was someone associated with Tammany Hall, which is something historically regarded as the height of urban corruption. And he had a quote, I tweeted out, I'm blanking what the exact quote was. You can nominate whoever you want as long as I get to count the votes. And there's no question that turnout is what wins elections. No one denies this. And if you turn out your people and you make sure the other people don't turn out, you're going to win regardless of what the electorate might want in another circumstance.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. I mean, turnout and a lot of these other things are the whole game, So that was a huge part of the push behind, say, mail-in voting. It wasn't that long ago. I mean, even 10 years ago, you'd read stories in the New York Times, and the New York Times would say, "Well, actually, mail-in voting is the largest source of electoral fraud in the United States." And yes, there's not a huge amount of fraud necessarily in American elections, thank God. But the reality is anytime you have an election with 160 million votes cast, you're going to have fraud around the margins. And then you start having elections that are decided by 40,000 votes across a handful of states. And all of a sudden, it does cast a lot of doubt onto things, just in terms of like people's, confidence in the system. And, mail-in balloting was, obviously a huge part of that. Democrats, wanted it for whatever, Democratic activists and campaign people have come out and flat out said that mail-in balloting was key to Joe Biden's victory. For whatever reason, Democrats they tend to have a lot more sort of human volunteers in terms of union personnel, in terms of young Democratic activists that are willing to like go out in the streets and do things like ballot harvest, which is where you have third parties going around to nursing homes and other places where there are a lot of people and collecting ballots and delivering them. And so that was a big part of their strategy. And at the same time this was going on, there was a million lawsuits, for instance, to get rid of, say, signature matching, which is like one of the few security measures that mail ballots have. And the fact that mail balloting was prone to fraud was not this isn't some like crazy thing. MIT and Caltech put out a report a little over a decade ago that said that states should curb or do away with mail ballots altogether in favor of expanding the length of time that people can vote in person, because it's that much more susceptible to fraud. I mean, Jimmy Carter led a bipartisan, commission on this stuff that concluded that mail-in balloting fraud was a problem. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, you could say this, and then all of a sudden last year, if you were questioning mail-in balloting, you were anti-democracy.
What one of the biggest things I learned while reading this book was about the role Mark Zuckerberg had in terms of getting ballots counted and verifying elections. Can you break down what you and Molly describe as Zuck bucks in this book? Because that is something I'm shocked isn't like a Tucker Carlson talking point every 5 minutes.
It's crazy. It's one of these things where I don't know where to begin. I mean, I guess just because the year was so crazy that people just weren't keyed into it. Now people are definitely starting to pay attention to it, and it's become a thing. So basically, what happened was this. Well, we could really go back to 2016, where Trump wins this surprising election, and of course, immediately following the election, what happens? Everyone starts casting about for villains for how Trump got elected, and they settled on basically two villains. One was Russia, and that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down. But the other big villain was Facebook. And it was interesting because at the time, Mark Zuckerberg was like, "Are you crazy?" I mean, like, how can you blame Facebook for this? But the funny thing is there was so much internal revolt within his own company that within a couple of months, Facebook was running this new fact checking program to censor the news and all this other stuff, and there was all this pressure on Facebook to basically interfere in the election. So what happens, and by the time 2020 rolls around, Mark Zuckerberg has this foundation with his wife called the Zuckerberg Chan Foundation. On the board of directors is David Plouffe, Obama's former campaign manager, who's like one of the Democrats' top like sort of political data guys.
And he's a brilliant person,
Right.
because Obama was a long shot in 2008. We don't I mean, you and I are old enough to remember when he first started, it was a given Hillary was going to win. It was basically a formality. She had been anointed, and like, yeah, Obama's cool and he's got some cred, but Pluff was a major figure, as well as Oprah, in making him a legitimate contender for her. And once he had that air of legitimacy, it was all over, because her big claim to fame was she was the viable candidate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And but more to the point, though, in addition to him having all those skills politically, I mean, he's like a technical like data guy, right? He knows where to find the votes, basically. And so what happened was, COVID was going on, and the Zuckerberg Chan Foundation um, offered up $400 million in grants to local election offices. Now, mind you, I am not talking about Mark Zuckerberg spending money and, campaign donations or anything of that sort. They were offering grants directly to nonpartisan local election offices, literally the people who count the votes. And these were ostensibly COVID relief grants, basically. They were, sold as they were going to pay for PPE for poll workers and other things like that. But instead, what happened was is they funneled these grants basically through two previously pretty small nonprofit foundations. One was called the Center for Tech and Civic Life, and the other was called CEIR, and I forget what CEIR stands for. But basically, they funneled these through these two nonprofit groups that were basically staffed and run by a bunch of left-wing Democratic activists, and they would parachute into local election offices, and they would offer them these grants to administer their elections, but there were all these strings attached. So pretty soon, Mark Zuckerberg's hand-appointed activists were designing ballots. They were determining where drop boxes would be put to collect ballots. They were translating ballots. I mean, they were doing all these things that unelected nonpartisan. I mean, essentially, well, they're technically nonpartisan, but unelected left-wing activists had no business doing. And it basically they ended up running a Democratic get out the vote operation outside of out from inside of local election offices, basically. And the thing about this, though, is that if you look at how the money ended up being allocated, it was incredibly strategic, like a huge amount of money. Like I've got some stats here somewhere, but a huge amount of the money basically almost went to swing states. The last stat I heard, people are still crunching the numbers on this, that 93% of the Zuckerberg grants went to counties where there was a majority of Democratic voters. And then if you look at the disparities, so like in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, huge cache of Democratic votes, the Zuckerberg people spent something like $6.50 in grants per person in the county, but like the nearest Republican county got like 50 cents from the Zuckerberg people. Basically, the whole thing was an operation to turn out more Democratic voters. They spent $400 million on this. In one case, in Green Bay, Wisconsin, the one of the local election administrators quit her job a week or two before the election, saying, "I've got nothing to do because I've been supplanted by all the Zuckerberg activists," and the mayor just defers to them. I mean, it's total insanity. And what's the most insane thing about all of this is that it all appears to be perfectly legal. I mean, no one ever thought a billionaire, well, that runs the largest, information platform the world has ever known, would come in with this kind of money and decide to, control American elections. But that's exactly what happened.
There was a really funny situation. I'm jumping around the book a little bit. You and Molly kind of chose your words very carefully when you were discussing former Mayor Giuliani and, let's say, his somewhat erratic behavior
Yeah.
in terms of defending President Trump's interest as a consequence of the election. Can you get into that a little
Yeah.
bit?
So what happened was obviously there were a million lawsuits that were flying around immediately after the election. A lot of those lawsuits weren't very good, shall we say. But one of the few areas where there was like actually a really great lawsuit was in Pennsylvania, where what happened was this, where there were Democratic counties in the state that just basically decided to totally disregard the state's election laws. So, according to like laws in Pennsylvania, you're not supposed to be what they call curing ballots, which is to say, if you get a mail in ballot and there's some sort of obvious problem with it that disqualifies the ballot, you don't get to send it back to the voter and say, hey, fix this. But what happened was in Pennsylvania,
Oh,
there
and let me
were
interrupt because these statutes, as you discuss in the book, are not ambiguous or particularly open for analysis. It'll
no,
say this must happen, must, this must, not shall or may. It's
correct.
very clear because they're supposed to uphold the sanctity of the vote and the democracy.
Right. And more to the point, they're passed into law by democratically by the legislature,
Right.
right? These are not, matters of discretion for election administrators, right? And so what was happening in Pennsylvania was these, Democratic counties in Philadelphia and other places were basically like disregarding all of the election laws and, that dictated how mail ballots must be specifically handled, right? Meanwhile, all the Republican counties were like strictly adhering to these, rules. So that creates a situation, the legal term is called disparate impact,
Yeah.
basically. So if one county is like allowing all these ballots that other counties aren't, basically they're diluting the votes of the other counties that are actually following the law. Now, this is not fraud, right? This is, a very sort of different thing legally. And there was a case, run by a lawyer in Philadelphia who, she had lots of experience doing this stuff. The judge was very amenable to it. The case was proceeding along very well. And what happened is Giuliani and, on the behest of Trump and his people, whatever, parachuted into Philadelphia, tried to Bigfoot the case, basically turned it into a fraud case, which it was not. The Republican lawyers that had attached themselves to this case were basically immediately trying to like flee to get out of the case because they knew it was going to blow up and reflect badly on them. But it was just a case of Trump and his people being so like adamant to like, don't just stand there, do something, and prove some sort of dramatic case that wasn't there, and it just totally imploded in their face. And this was a chance for Republicans to actually, score a real victory, for election integrity, and Giuliani blew the whole thing up.
Hey guys, Michael Malice here. We all want to make sure our family's protected in a medical emergency, but what many of us don't realize is health insurance won't always cover the full amount of an emergency medical flight. So even with comprehensive coverage, you get hit with high deductibles and copays. And that's why an Air Medcare Network membership is so important. As a member, if an emergency arises, you won't see a bill for air medical transport when flown by an AMCN provider. And best of all, membership covers your entire household for as little as $85 a year. That's practically nothing. AMCN providers are called upon to transfer more than 100,000 patients a year. This is coverage no family should be without. And now, as a listener of our show, God help you, you'll get up to a $50 gift card with a new membership. You just have to visit airmedcarenetwork.com/malice and use offer code malice. Easy peasy. Hey guys, Michael Malice here. Want to talk to you about Ipvanish. You ever feel like you're being followed around the internet and people know too much about you? So our sponsor, Ipvanish VPN, helps you take back your privacy and become anonymous on the internet. Ipvanish is a virtual private network. It's a VPN. It's an important tool that helps you safely browse the internet. You can use it on your computer, your tablet, your phone, wherever you're streaming media. When you use a VPN, all your data is encrypted. What you're reading, those websites you shouldn't be on, what you're watching, whatever it is you're doing. And that's important because what you're doing on the internet is no one's business except for yours. And for listeners of the show, Ipvanish is offering 65% off their annual plan. It's only $375 a month. You turn on with one click and runs in the background. Protects you while you're browsing the web. And if you boomers run into a problem, they have 24/7 support by email, chat, and telephone. Telephone. If you go to ipvanish.com/malice and use promo code malice, MALICE, that's me, you claim 65% off your for the savings. Annual plan just is only $44.99 for the first year with our exclusive discount. This is the time to sign up with our discount and their promotion. You get a VPN for 65% off. They're the best, rated 4.7 out of 5 on Trustpilot with over 6,000 reviews. Go to ipvanish.com/malice to get the deal and start protecting yourself online. Let's get back to the show. There was one person whose name I'm blanking on, but you have him basically as the villain of the book in terms of someone who's a prominent lawyer who's been behind a lot of these Democratic machinations to change election laws to favor the outcome they prefer. What's the name of the person I'm referring to?
I think you're referring to Mark Elias.
Yes, yeah. Can you discuss what his role has been in terms of changing electoral laws legally in
Right.
order to benefit an outcome that he would find preferable?
So Mark Elias is he's just kind of a Democratic super lawyer, and he has represented the Democratic Party in just about every big election lawsuit. I mean, I think he rose to prominence with, I don't know if you remember the Al Franken senatorial election in 2008, where Franken won by something like 400 votes, and it was this incredibly protracted, drawn out thing about what votes they would and would not count. And subsequently, there's been a lot of question about whether Franken actually did win that vote.
And that vote and that Franken victory was what was deciding whether Democrats would have a supermajority in the Senate, which would enable them to eliminate the filibuster and push through Obamacare. So this was not this was an extremely crucial Senate seat.
Yeah, it was extraordinarily consequential that he won by 400 votes, and subsequently there are a bunch of analyses and things like that that showed that a bunch of felons that weren't supposed to have voted and other things that according to the state's election laws did. And I'm not saying definitively Franken didn't deserve the seat, but the point is it was hotly contested, and Mark Elias sort of rose to prominence for being the guy that sorted all that out. And it was also interesting because that was one of the first big cases where election law got married with all this like data analysis that we talk about here, where they were able to determine which votes from what areas, from what type of demographics would be most likely to benefit the Democrats and stuff. And that's really how the Democrats beat the Republicans in that particular election. But anyway, Elias is just basically like, and I mean, you got to give the guy credit, actually. I mean, he's just kind of one of these big operators, win at all costs. He's been on like both sides of like every election issue. It doesn't matter if it's just about whatever he can do to make sure that Democrats win their elections.
And that's what you want for a lawyer. You want your lawyer to take whatever tools he has in order to guarantee that you get a victory.
But strictly in terms of like integrity, I mean, like, he's been on lawsuits where he said that voting machines were compromised. He's been on other lawsuits where he said voting machines made by exactly the same manufacturer, where he was defending their integrity. So point is he's just not like a moral barometer. I mean, he's a lawyer at the end of the day, right? And more than that, though, he's perhaps most famous because he is the guy that was the behind the spreading of the Steele dossier. He was the lawyer that acted as the pass-through, right, between the Fusion GPS group and the Democratic National Party, because you have a lawyer in between, because then you can claim attorney-client privilege, and so that prevents law enforcement from getting in there investigating what exactly you're doing. Anyway, but he has been, for well over a decade now, been like the guy that they go to fight all of these cases. And, like I said, he's not exactly what one would call a trustworthy barometer of what is fair in terms of election law. But at the same time, Democrats have turned him into this just absolute like folk hero. And it's just absolutely crazy that a man with his track record would be like upheld as this like paragon of election integrity and making sure that voter suppression isn't happening, when the reality is like he just doesn't care. And there's example after example of him just doing whatever he can to win.
But why wasn't the Republican Party more aware of because this was being done in plain view, of what was happening state by state throughout 2020 and earlier?
So that's a really good question, and it's kind of a complicated thing. We go into the book in this in various facets, but there's a couple of crazy things. Like, I've been reporting in politics in DC for 20 years, and I did not know this until I wrote this book, which is absolutely insane. It blew my mind, which is to say that there was a New Jersey gubernatorial election in the early 1980s. And I don't remember, there were some shenanigans, but basically, I don't remember what exactly the Republican Party did wrong. but
Right.
a federal judge put them under an order that basically forbid the Republican National Committee, the National Republican Organization, not a small organization, from engaging in any election day activities for nearly 30 years. He enforced this injunction after he retired from the bench and took senior status. I mean, this went on and on. It was like a personal crusade of this one man to stop the RNC from being involved in election day stuff. And it was finally overturned a year or two ago by, I believe it was an Obama appointed judge who looked at this and just, I think the guy died actually. The judge died. That was how it ended. An Obama appointed judge looked at this and went, this is absolutely bonkers. And, let Republicans back into the fray. And this was the first election in almost 30 years or around 30 years where the Republican Party was actually able to do like organizing activities on election day. So on one hand, there just really wasn't a lot of like muscle memory in the RNC for handling a lot of this stuff. The other thing is simply that just in terms of actual sort of expertise and firepower, the Republican Party is just totally overwhelmed. Especially in the Trump era. Trump being Trump, he scared off a lot of good people, I think, that normally would be associated with the Republican Party. And more than that, the left was, threatening and intimidating people. I mean, even in the case of in a few post-election lawsuits, you saw the Lincoln Project was literally like telling people to call certain law firms and tell them that they can't, let the Republicans do anything on behalf of Trump. I mean, there's basically been a major intimidation campaign in the legal community and from all walks of life that the left has successfully organized that kept Republicans from sort of getting into up to their eyeballs in these kinds of lawsuits. But and part of it was just, I think, just general incompetence. I mean, Trump seemed to recognize that this was going to be a problem, but they just simply weren't adequately prepared and they didn't have the firepower for it. And there are all these structural things working against them.
You and Molly also discuss in the book that Time magazine article, which was kind
Yes.
of a smoking gun. It was shocking to very many people because, there's this concept that is often used as something as a conspiracy theory, and you just throw it out and then right away you don't have to listen to the person any further. But when you point out a conspiracy is simply the claim that international elites are more interested in protecting their own power and interest than that of the country where they're from, then it becomes somewhat indisputable. Can you break down that article and how they were basically almost like the supervillain at the end of a movie, or the superhero, I guess, depending on your politics, boasting about how they secured the
Yeah.
election?
So there was this story written in Time magazine by Molly Ball, who's a sort of hotshot journalist in DC, who recently authored a biography of Nancy Pelosi, and I heartily encourage all of your viewers to go out there and take a look at this biography of Pelosi. I remember the Wall Street Journal review was something like, if I ever write anything this, fawning, that I would strongly suggest that that an editor, tell me I find a career in public relations or something like that. I mean, it was something else. But anyway, that's Molly Ball, and she writes this article about literally, quote unquote, a well-funded cabal that were, quote, fortifying the election and, quote, controlling the flow of information. And the article is all about how all these Democratic activist groups, corporate CEOs, and unions basically got together and like started having like, sub rosa conference calls and all this other stuff where they were dedicated to basically like manipulating the media and changing the rules and doing all this stuff. And again, it's all stuff that is, quote unquote, legal as far as anyone knows. But, it was definitely like moneyed interests, getting together. And, if you're going to believe that these people actually have your best interest in mind as an individual voter, I mean, you're crazy. I mean, these are powerful people that decided they didn't want Trump in the White House anymore for whatever reason, and that they were going to use all of their influence, to make that happen. And, and at the end of the day, Time Magazine writes this article, about literally calling them a well-funded cabal, saying all this. And it was amazing at the time. I don't know what it says about this. I mean, you're kind of the expert in this. I mean, it's almost Soviet. I mean, the power here is, not that they're deceiving you so much as they're just making you accept whatever they tell you, right?
Right.
And in this case, that's exactly what it was. They were just like, you know what, we're controlling this election. We're going to write about what we did, and there's not a darn thing that you can do about it. In fact, you're supposed to like this.
One of the big gets that happened as a consequence of writing this book was Molly got to interview President Trump at length. How can you explain how that happened?
Trump is an interesting character, and obviously he's very much a media junkie. I mean, that's kind of how he became Trump. I mean, he leveraged the entire New York media establishment more or
Right.
less to build up his reputation. So he, very early on, I think, picked up on who in the media he thought were interesting and influential people, and he kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say he went out of his way, but he certainly cultivated a relationship with Molly, in terms of establishing contact and things like that, and made it known that the door would be open if if she in particular wanted to talk to him. And so she went down to Mar-a-Lago 2 or 3 times to talk to him about that. And he and my I don't know, I think my wife is like sort of a special gift as far as Trump is concerned. Like at one point she gave me the tapes of the Trump interviews, and she's like, "Hey, can you listen to these interviews and tell me if there's anything interesting in here that we didn't include in the book?" And I literally, like, I came upstairs like an hour and a half later, like shaking. I'm like, I don't know how you can listen to this man. I know he's not like coked up, but he sounds like he's coked up, and he's talking in like 8 different directions at once or whatever. And my wife just has this like gift or whatever. And like, I think this is part of the thing with Trump. Like, he's not a dumb individual. In fact, part of the problem, I think, in Washington, D.C. is that it's this tyranny of people with like 130 IQs. Like,
115, the midwits. Yeah.
well, I would say even more than that. They're
Okay.
like, they're definitely above average intellects, but they are like above average enough to give them like an absolute ego about everything,
Yeah,
right?
that's a midwit. You're defining midwits.
Okay.
They're marginally intelligent, and therefore, for example, if someone is, let's break this down for people. If someone is 6 foot tall, right?
Yeah.
That person is objectively speaking tall. However, the amount of time someone will comment on this person's height is virtually nothing, right? So they're going to be
Right.
insecure about their height and their stature. You're 6'5", a lot of people are going to comment your height. You're often going to be the tallest one in the room. So if someone has a 115 IQ, they are objectively smart. They have one standard deviation above average, but the amount of time they're going to be commented on their intelligence is going to be almost nil. As a result, they're going to seek any opportunity they have to signal intelligence, although they don't have the much intelligence signal. So these are the people on Twitter who will point out when you've made a typo, as if this is demonstration of higher education. And that's why the name of this show is You're Welcome, YOUR. And when they correct it, they say it's misspelled. First of all, it's not misspelled because they say this is You're Welcome. But more importantly, a proper noun by definition cannot be misspelled. So if you name your daughter Crystal and spell it with 7 C's, that's not misspelled. It's a proper name. But they don't
It,
understand this because they have marginal intelligence.
it's a midwit detection device, right?
Yes, yes,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, so that's exactly it. I mean, like, the reality is that the people that really are sort of world changing forces, almost more often than not, tend to be people like Trump or Elon Musk. I think would be a good
Sure,
example.
yeah.
Where you may or may not like these people, you may or may not think they're a force for good, but the reality is their intellect and the way that they operate is significantly outside norms, right?
Right, right.
Those are the people that really sort of like shift the conversation. And obviously the midwits of the world, and more, but even in DC, even worse than the midwit problem is the credentialed
Oh
problem,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. It goes hand in hand. Yeah.
It goes hand in hand. Obviously just, could not take that. I mean, it drove them just absolutely insane. They've got a, master's degree in international relations from Johns Hopkins. How dare Trump talk about Russia? I mean, it
Mark,
was
Jill Biden's a doctor.
right. Dr.
Right.
Joe
Make sure
Biden,
you call her
right.
Dr. Biden. Yeah, sure.
Right. Um, that's actually a classic example. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I remember, back when Joe was a senator, it was a joke in liberal newsrooms. It was a joke. People used to like openly mock the idea of Dr. Jill Biden
Of course. Yeah.
among liberal reporters because it was, so obviously stupid. And then all of a sudden, Joe Biden's running for president, and it's like, how dare you, sexist, horrible human being for
Right.
suggesting it. But anyway, yeah, just that is who Trump is. I mean, he's very sort of, WYSIWYG in terms of, being this sort of crazy guy in a lot of ways, but he's not nearly as crazy as people think he is. But I do think in terms of my wife, she has this like real ability to sort of like tap into how he speaks and how he thinks in a way that she innately understands how he thinks about things. And more than that, the fact he is so odd in certain ways, I think distracts from the fact that the bottom line is, whatever you want to say about Trump, he was much more in tune with where the average Republican voter was in 2016 than almost anyone else in the Republican establishment. And that in and of itself, the Republican Party and the DC establishment has never really gotten over that. I mean, this is the thing. They keep saying Trump is some sort of weird cult. Well, no, actually, in a lot of ways, Trump came to where the voters were,
Oh
you
yeah,
know?
for sure.
And the voters were already like done with the Republican Party in foreign policy. They were already done with the Republican Party on trade. They're already done with the Republican Party on immigration. Trump's the first guy that comes along, goes to where they are, and they're saying, oh, well, you're just worshiping this cult leader. And it's like, no, he was the first guy that like acknowledged that their concerns were legitimate. I mean, for social conservatives, I mean, he was the first Republican president to show up at the pro-life march, like physically be there, even though
Yeah.
it's held every year a couple blocks from the White House. Like that kind of thing got him a lot of affection from people, and frankly, deservedly so. It wasn't like a cult thing.
Well,
Um,
the Republican base is Kyle Rittenhouse. The Republican leadership is Dennis Hastert, and
yeah,
I think that's pretty much
yeah.
it defines the Republican Party and why I have so much contempt for them.
Yeah, but I mean, and that's exactly, and that's a very good way of putting it. And I think that and until the Republican Party like comes to terms with that, both in terms of what who Trump was and what he represented, they're not going to be able to move beyond quote Trump. I mean, they want to move beyond Trump. Well, you can do that if you recognize what Trump did and how it was beneficial for your party. But they refuse to do that. They just want to chalk it all up to Trump being insane. When the reality is no, he wasn't insane. He was just different, and not only was he different, he was like significantly more perceptive than the whole rest of you lot, in key ways.
Was she nervous about going to meet him?
I think anytime you go down into sort of that situation, like first of all, it's not just like Trump, who's, a larger than life personality. I mean, it's at a place like Mar-a-Lago and all this
Right.
other stuff. It's definitely there's a lot of pomp and circumstance, in a sort of off kilter way. But on the other hand, my wife is pretty darn fearless. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. And the other thing is, my wife is always really well prepared. She's not like a person that just stumbles into things.
Yeah, but
So
I don't care how prepared you are. If you're sitting down with Donald Trump, you're not. He's not sticking to your questions. He's
right.
rambling about whatever he wants.
Right. Well, and honestly, I will say, I mean, I think there was like that was a little bit of a problem in the sense that, he would say these things that were like great and like, oh, we're going to throw that in the book. But Trump was also talking to like 25 other people that were writing books, maybe 22 of which he probably shouldn't have been talking to because
Right.
they're like such hostile, liberal
Like Michael
journalists.
Wolff is a great example of that.
Yeah, exactly. But he is who he is at the end of the day, and he very much wants to be like, and still can't let go of that weird affection for the media. But he was absolutely helpful, and he is by all accounts been wonderful to my wife, and everyone I've ever known that really has had any personal interaction with him has really had nothing bad to say about him. Like maybe their interaction was frustrating, but like on a personal level, like no one has ever said he was mean or bad or anything like that. He's just he's Trump.
Well, no, there's one exception. He broke Penn Jillette. So Penn Jillette was probably one of the most prominent libertarians of all time, a member of the Libertarian Party, always advocated for his show bullshit for libertarian principles. He was on The Apprentice twice. For those who don't know, there was a great moment when Penn was up against Trace Adkins for the Celebrity Apprentice All-Stars, right? And they had a final challenge, and Penn completely wiped the floor with him. It was not even close. And Trace Adkins clearly didn't want to be there. He's half asleep in his chair. Like Penn it was just like a completely black and white situation. And Trump's about to pick the winner live. And Trump goes, "Hey, Penn, I just saw this interview where after the first season, you thought I was a bad person and were making fun of my hair. Do you still feel that way?" And Penn just does this like hem and haw. And he's like, "Oh, no." And Trump goes, "Thank you very much. Trace, you are the apprentice." And it was the pettiest, most FU. But as a consequence of this, Penn is now taking photos where he's literally hugging Gavin Newsom. He refuses to allow the use of pronouns on his television show because his daughter came out as trans, female to male, and he's completely gone over to the lefties. So that is one person who's met Trump who thinks, my God, he's a horrible person.
Well, and that's the other thing about him is, I mean, he is like Rain Man for trolling, basically.
Does that make me Tom Cruise?
right.
I have his size.
But yeah, he has this like incredibly innate gift for just like zeroing in on people's like weak spots, right? And that's again who he is. And obviously the fact that people took some sort of enjoyment in that was also another just like huge problem for the establishment. Like on one hand, I get it. Like some of it was genuinely mean spirited, and like
Oh, yeah.
the Christian in me revolted from that. But on the other hand, I've been in this town for 20 years, and of all the people that need to be deflated, the people that live inside the Beltway, I mean, it's absolutely astonishing that these people weren't more secure in their accomplishments and their supposed credentials, that they couldn't handle this, but they couldn't. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about the DC establishment. It should have been really easy to parry like a bunch of dumb ad hominems
Right.
about porn stars or whatever, but they couldn't do it. They just couldn't. Like, they just blew gaskets constantly.
Guys, let me talk to you about inflation. It's skyrocketed by 6.2% last month. It's the highest it's been in 30 years. And you don't need a PhD in economics to know that $100,000 you're holding can turn into 94,000 really quick if you don't act. How do you stop your cash from turning to trash? Experts are investing in an asset class everyone's overlooking, one that overperforms the S&P 500 by sixfold when inflation is above 3%. It's not real estate, it's not gold or even crypto. Previously, only the ultra wealthy could afford this opportunity. And now guys like you and me can get into the action. There's only one tech platform that's unlocked this asset class, and more than 250,000 members have signed up. Demand's higher than ever. You can skip the wait list by going to masterworks.io/you're welcome. That's masterworks.io/you're welcome. Previous offerings have sold out in hours. Don't wait, and see important disclosures at masterworks.io/disclaimer. Guys, look at this studly hunk. That's me. And I'm wearing my Sheath underwear. Sheath underwear is the best underwear for several reasons. One, they have a dual pouch system. This was developed by Bobby, who's the company's founder, after he spent a summer in Iraq. They've got one pouch for one part of your anatomy, another pouch for another part of your anatomy. They also have girls' underwear, but I don't know what goes where. And since no women listen to the show, why would I even talk about it? If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice, you get 20% off today. And the great thing about Sheath is they support all those shows. Support the underwear that supports you. You get comfort, you get performance, you get mobility, and you get the coolest underwear on earth. You get inside my pants. First time I wore it, true story. I tell a story all the time. What is this? And now I wear it every day. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice, you get 20% off. They've got a ton of styles to choose from, including soon a style that I designed. Let's get back to the show. Well, I think the issue was, and I'm curious to hear if you agree with me, for a long time, there's been a WWF style pantomime between the Republicans and Democrats where Mitch McConnell goes on TV and he says, truthfully, I'm fighting Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, blah, 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 come back and vote for me. And Nancy Pelosi gets on TV, says, truthfully, I'm fighting Mitch McConnell and the evil Republicans vote for me. And they both get their money and they both, their dance. And then Trump walks in and now they have to do improv. Because as opposed to having their scripted, well-rehearsed roles as the good guy, the bad guy, respectively, in each one's home district, now you don't know what this loon's going to say next, and you have to be quick on your feet. And Mitch McConnell can't do anything on his feet because he has polio.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, that's exactly right. Now, increasingly, I've been won over by the professional wrestling analogy, like the kayfabe and all that other stuff. I mean, it makes perfect sense of it. I mean, maybe we should make like Billy Corgan or one of these like pro wrestling guys, a political analyst, they would do a lot better. But yeah, it's also true that Trump exposed, the other thing is, the artifice behind so much of what happens in Washington. Right. So like Nietzsche has this term, regulative fiction, he calls it, or whatever, which is that, the reality of all human affairs, especially at high levels and stuff, is like really messy. I mean, we're self-interested creatures and all these other things, and like all kinds of bad stuff happens behind the scenes. But we tell ourselves these grand narratives, these like regulative fictions, to like make sense of what's going on, right? So we feel good about being on the right side of history or whatever, and all this nonsense. And I think even before Trump, there was this big discordant thing happening where, partly a result of the technology of the information age, but partly just simply because the general moral and, actual talent decline of America's leadership class was getting to the point where these regulative fictions just couldn't be sustained anymore. And there was just all this discordance in voters' heads. And then Trump comes along and boom, just explodes it, like makes it like totally impossible to believe in these, grand narratives about people in Washington know exactly what they're doing and exactly what they're saying, and we should just heed to their leadership. And boy, wow, the people that were the beneficiaries of that regulative fiction did not like that at all.
Yeah, I had Justin Amash on my show. He's a former Republican congressman from Michigan who left the Republican Party after turning on Trump, and became a libertarian. He retired from Congress. And the question I always ask people who are like high up in politics is, which is DC more like, Veep or House of Cards? And he had said, if I remember correctly, he said Veep, but he said the point people don't get is no one cares about policy. So like even on Veep, like she's fighting for filibuster reform or like, pre-K, public pre-K. He's like, they don't care. He's like, I would try to talk about these issues with like even Republicans, and it was just like talking to a wall.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that's a very astute observation, but I would also say, yeah, Veep is the answer, right? But at the same time, when something goes wrong on Veep, people laugh,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
when things, when things go wrong in DC and when someone, laughs about oopsie, kids get droned. I
Yeah.
mean, that's where we're at with this, and that's just really sort of terrifying me. Like at the same time, I think, honest to God, maybe the single most damaging thing to American politics in the last 2 decades was the West Wing. And I'm like deadly serious about this. Like I arrived in DC in 1999, and oh my gosh, there was just like just hordes of like earnest liberals that like bought hook, line, and sinker into that show. And you want to talk about regulative fiction? Holy crap! The idea that this was, all a bunch of just completely altruistic, humanistic Democrats running everything. I mean, the West Wing is basically to American politics what sort of pornography is to sex, essentially, in the sense that it completely leaves you with unrealistic expectations and real world disappointment if you believe that sort of narrative. And I think that it was, it just, there was this bill of goods sold to people in terms of what politics should be. And it's one thing if you're like if you're looking at that in historical terms and you're like elevating an Abraham Lincoln or a George Washington, right? But it's quite another thing when you're like spinning those narratives like as it happens, through an idealized version of the freaking Clinton White House, which is
Yeah.
what the West Wing was. And it's appalling to me that people ever got away with that. It's just appalling.
Yeah. Has there been any kind of, as a result of your book and as a start of the Time magazine article, has there been any semblance in the Republican Party of we got to get it together or else we're going to be doomed to be a permanent minority?
So this is what I'm actually very pleased about. When we wrote this book and we called it Rigged, how the media, big tech, and Democrats seize their elections, we were obviously worried about this because there was, like I said, there's all this pressure being brought to bear from different institutional forces. Like we were worried that people were going to say, even though we never used the word stolen once in that book, we don't assert that that's what happened, that all these people were going to say like, how dare you, undermine confidence in our elections, and there'd be all this pressure on our careers and other things like that. But that really hasn't happened because I think even the people on the left kind of know they got away with it. And people on the right, at the same time, were happy to be somewhat validated into, not for the crazy conspiracies, but at least to understand that so much of what happened in terms of like tolerating riots for months and, not being able to talk about the origin of the COVID virus or any of this other stuff was totally a wrong thing to do in the middle of an election. So, the reception has been much better than I hoped in that respect. But the other thing is, on the few key issues, the Zuckerberg stuff in particular, a bunch of states have now passed laws making it illegal finally for private money to go in to fund election administration. I mean, right now there's a bill a bunch of Democrats have in Congress because basically, I remember it was like a year or two ago, a bunch of wealthy Texans got together and were funding National Guard actions at the border. I mean, I'm a son of a Marine colonel, and let me tell you, like the idea of private millionaires funding military options is terrifying. It's a terrible idea. Why would anyone ever do that? But at the same token, if you think that's bad, why would you think that the private funding of election administration and counting the votes is an okay thing to do? And so that narrative has definitely gotten out in the Republican Party. States are passing all kinds of laws against it. And more than that, they're doing a lot of analysis now. Like what meager analysis we had and included in the book, now different organizations are coming out with this incredibly detailed analysis about the spending that Zuckerberg did and the effect it had on turnout and other things. And each time they come out with this stuff, it just looks incredibly damning.
Yes, but just at a very simple, even if I had no idea about politics, if I'm seeing, 10 times as much money going to certain areas as to others, I'm going to deduce there's got to be some reason for it. Now, whether it could be population density, I can steel man it for Zuckerberg's position as much as I can, but that clearly can't be an accident, that there's some kind of decision making being made where the money's being allocated. It's not coincidental.
Yeah, no, it was like it was like 5 or 6, like Georgia got 5 or 6 times as much money as neighboring Florida, and Florida has twice the population. And then if you look within Georgia, what counties that money went to, it was like, overwhelmingly Cobb County and the populous Democratic counties. And the result was that I think Georgia moved 5 points away from Trump from the 2016 election, whereas Florida, where they spent hardly any money in comparison, moved 2 points in Trump's direction. I mean, if correlation is not causation, but man, there's a lot of smoke here where if you think there's fire lurking in the distance. It just absolutely, every time you do the matchup of where the money and dollars were spent, it definitely corresponds to Biden getting more votes.
Let's talk about Georgia, because this is the thing that I've seen conservatives be the most upset about, was that footage of the people from this, and please put in your words, they were counting votes. Someone decided to stop counting votes. Then certain people just started counting votes on their own. They're pulling ballots out from under a desk or something. Can you break down what that video was that night in Georgia?
So basically, what happened was at some point, it was around 10 p.m. I want to say. Don't quote me on this. Read the book. Basically, they announced that they were, going to stop counting votes for the evening, and that everyone should go home, including the election observers and the media.
And let me interrupt you, because I there's something I can't wrap my head around. If this is a presidential election, which is extremely crucial, right?
Yeah.
Why? What? You can't work overtime? You can't find someone to take over a second shift? Like, what's the reasoning here?
Well, that was the thing, is when we talk about this, I mean, there are all these like behind the scenes phone calls of people calling up and being like, "What the hell are you doing? How can you possibly do this?" To the election administrators and things like that.
You had one job. This
Right.
is your one job. Count the votes. You can sit at home for 364 days. This is your job.
And there were stories of like flooding within the massive, like, if it was like an arena or something that they were counting the ballots in and other things. I mean, there was all this stuff going on. I mean, there was a lot of like just sort of crossfire, but we do know that there were like multiple contemporaneous reports by news organizations saying everyone was told to go home. Okay. And everyone did kind of go home. And then the counting resumed after that. And basically, yes, they have on video, they have people pulling out what they call these suitcases, which are like these special containers they use to hold ballots out, and they pull them up and they appear to, open them up and start counting ballots again. Well, nobody really quite knows what happened. Subsequently, after this video emerged and the Trump people started to make a big deal about it, one of Facebook's fact-checking partners did a fact check, basically saying that, oh, well, this is all nothing to see here. And of course, when one of Facebook's fact-checking partners declares something, that means that you can't put it on the platform anymore, right? Facebook's own press releases brag that they kill 80% of the global internet traffic to, when one of their stories that they declare false, gets entered into Facebook's system as misinformation. So nobody has ever really gotten to the bottom of, what exactly happened there, why they told everyone to go home, and why they were still there, and why they still appear to be counting ballots. I mean, it's just an absolute mess. Plus, there was just all kinds of other procedural problems in Georgia where, again, there was a lot of what one would call potentially illegal votes. They weren't necessarily fraudulent, but like they weren't accounting for the fact that people were voting in the wrong precinct or the wrong county or other things like that. The votes that shouldn't have been counted. There were all kinds of problems. But this is a whole other issue. Not all of this stuff is even necessarily nefarious. The reality is that America spends very little on election administration in this country. We need to probably make it a much bigger priority than we do. And we need to, put a lot more sort of scrutiny and integrity measures into the system so that people can have more confidence in it. Of course, Democrats don't want that. For whatever reason, you can't necessarily infer that this is proof of fraud, but for whatever reason, they seem to perceive that having much laxer rules benefits them, and they fight any attempt to sort of, tighten the system. You end up with situations where, like, Pew did a study 10 years ago, 1 out of every 12 voter registrations in this country are significantly inaccurate. Knowing that, and then you hear that, like, the state of California is sending out ballots to every voter registration on file. How many ballots were sent out to people, that aren't at addresses that they haven't lived at in years? I mean, you're talking about literally, with the amount of ballots they sent out over the mail in states that automatically did it, there were probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of ballots
You
that
could
just
anyone
went to
could just ask
addresses.
themselves how often they get mail at their address that's not meant for them. Like,
Correct.
everyone listening to this can think of how many times that happens to some
Well,
previous occupant or something like that.
census data tells us that 1 out of every 10 people move every year. I mean,
Okay, yeah.
and no one and voter offices aren't spending the money to keep the voter files up to date. Their county, like Los Angeles County, got sued a couple of years ago because they had a voter registration rate of 130%, meaning that they had, they had more people but more voter registration on file than lived in the county. I mean, this and California is going to send out ballot applications or ballots to every person in the state. Are you kidding me?
There was something else you guys talked about in the book, which I found very interesting, which is I forget the official title, but basically the Commission on Presidential Debates, and how they were putting their finger on the button between these debates, which were held in obviously in unprecedented plague times. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So, well, you have this, quote unquote, nonpartisan organization, Commission on Presidential Debates, that helps organize these debates. And for a long time now, Republicans obviously have been grumbling about debates, and deservedly so. Remember in 2012, when Candy Crowley like rudely interrupts Mitt Romney to correct him, and it turns out she's like entirely wrong. I mean, first of all, no members of the corporate press should be moderating these debates with the way things are in that industry. I mean, it's ridiculous. So that right off the bat has made a lot of Republicans upset. Trump said that he tolerated Chris Wallace as a debate moderator from Fox in the first debate because Biden had turned down an interview with him, and Trump thought that might mean that Wallace could be more objective or something. I think that was just sort of a huge mistake.
Now, clearly,
Um,
Wallace flat out lied and says you're against critical race teaching. You're against critical race theory. What's wrong with teaching kids not to be racist? It was a complete non sequitur.
and he had several moments in that debate that were like incredible, in terms of someone who cares about fairness. So that right there, the whole format is already just stacked against you. And then we had a situation there where after that first debate turns into a total goat rodeo, right? Then they were supposed to have a second debate, and then there was the whole situation with Trump's COVID. They canceled the second debate, and one of the debates was supposed to be about foreign policy, and they were like, "Oh no, it's not about foreign policy anymore." And they just kept changing the rules. Then one of their other debate moderators got caught asking, "Oh my gosh, what's his name? Who was the Italian guy that was Trump's press secretary for New York Minute? Scaramucci."
Oh yeah, yeah. For 4 days or whatever it was. Yeah,
Yeah. One of the debate moderators gets caught publicly on Twitter asking Scaramucci for what questions he should ask. I mean, I think he thought he was DMing him or something like that. And so that turned into a goat rodeo. And Bob Dole eventually comes out and says, "Look, I know all the Republicans on this, debate commission. They all hate Trump, and they're all, a bunch of rhinos, basically." I mean, even Bob Dole was saying like, this is, it's not exactly anyone's idea of a rock-ribbed Trump supporter who's coming out and saying like, this commission's a joke. And I don't know what's going to happen in the next presidential election year, but the Republican Party cannot tolerate a debate situation like that. But on the other hand, like, I don't even know where you find an unbiased moderator. There was a huge push to get Joe Rogan to do it, and God bless Joe. I think he was nervous about doing that, and I don't blame him. But you need a figure like that, who is genuinely outside of the establishment media and has actually shown a commitment to being sort of impartial on these issues. And there's almost no one like that in the media.
I can't speak for Joe, but I would bet good money he wouldn't be nervous to do something like that. But at the same time, I think he would understand that it would be a bit of a sideshow in the sense that when you're a presidential nominee, you're not interested in having a debate. You're just interested in scoring points and getting your talking points across and getting it over on the other person, whoever that might be.
Oh yeah, no, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But point being that, like, I'm just saying that he's kind of a unique figure.
Oh, for sure.
In that regard, and that's the reason though why Joe Rogan is, as far as I'm concerned, the most powerful media figure in the country right now. Whether Rogan wants that mantle or not, he's earned it.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Pedicy.
I love hearing people's stories of resilience and grit. This is why I created this podcast.
We are very excited to welcome Jim Gaffigan, Yasmin Mohammed, Glenn Beck, Tim Dillon, Abigail Schreier, Jeff Garland, Ayan Hirsi Ali, Sam Harris, Heather Hying, Jonah Goldberg, Ben Shapiro, Glenn Greenwald, Sarah Shahi, Colin Quinn.
If there's a culture of victimhood, then let's tell stories of grit and survival.
Subscribe and listen now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's very funny because when you have that kind of arm's length look at how corporate media operates, because for a long time in 2020, there was article after article saying Joe Rogan's irrelevant now. The Spotify deal was a disaster. He's a moron. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's blown his show. He's lost his audience. Boo-hoo, he's got $100 million, whatever, right? 2021, stop listening to this idiot. he's making you take horse paste, stop going to the vet and stealing horse medicine, so on and so forth. It's like, wait. 5 minutes ago, you were saying he's lost his whole audience and he's not relevant. No one cares about him anymore. And now CNN has to directly address how Sanjay Gupta goes on and Joe Rogan very amiably completely humiliates him. And another point, which I've made before, which I'm sure you agree with, is it was very interesting how they all specifically said ivermectin was a horse dewormer when it's used for cats and dogs and is veterinary. Why are you specifically categorizing it as used for horses? So this is just an example of how they collude to push forth just some BS story.
My 80-something parents were both prescribed ivermectin by their doctor when they got COVID. I mean, it was bananas.
And the thing is, you should listen to the experts. They're listening to their doctor. They didn't go to the vet and say and put in a horse, two people in a horse costume, one's the ass, one's the head, and say, no, I have COVID. Give me the paste. Oh, here you go. You sure sound like Mark's mom, but I'll give it to you, talking horse.
Yes. Well, the other thing that got me about that was that he took the monoclonal antibodies, which are like the primary therapeutic that everyone recognizes. So it wasn't like he just took horse paste and ignored all the standard treatments. He took the monoclonal antibodies.
He had a whole list of treatments that he rattled off. Ivermectin wasn't even the first thing he listed, and they all coincidentally honed in on that, and they all, Joe Rogan thinks he's a centaur.
Well, but I mean, like, this is the thing, though, is again, they're doing this because they know that Joe Rogan is not just a threat to their credibility, he's a threat to their business model, right? That's it. I mean, the future of, look, my wife is in cable news, Fox has been great to her and everything else, but you look at the demographics of cable news and who the people that watch it are, it's going to be a very different place in 5 or 10 years. Younger people are not watching that stuff. So obviously everyone who makes, tons of money on, CNN, doesn't even get good ratings anymore. And, these guys are still making millions of dollars in prime time, and they're panicked. They're panicked. They know that it's not even Joe Rogan himself. It's what Joe Rogan represents, right? Joe Rogan is a stand-in for, you and lots of other tiny podcasts, no one's ever heard of. People
you and lots of other tiny podcasts.
No, I
Screw
meant,
you, Mark.
Sorry. I should have like added a comma.
Just because I'm 4'11", I take that very personal, sir.
Stop. I meant you as in like a known podcast and like comma, like a whole, like everyone else that is out there trying to do independent media. All right. So to be clear here, look, I wouldn't do this show if you were nobody, Michael.
Well,
I don't get out of bed for nobody.
The facts demonstrate the opposite.
Stop. I walked into that.
One of the things that a lot of conservatives had in their head was, as a result of 2020, no Republican's ever going to win anything again, right? Even though the Republicans picked up seats in the House, which from my understanding, no electoral forecast said. It was a consensus, and I don't think they were lying, all of them, that the Democrats, given the polls, were going to pick up a handful of seats and expand their House majority. Then came Virginia, and then came that seat in a gubernatorial race in New Jersey, which became within a hair. Which no one thought was going to be up for grabs. And the biggest reason, I think, has been discussed, is that people like Molly, which are conservative moms, saw what's going on with schools, and whether rightly or wrongly, they got out. They're like, we have to put a stop to this. What are you, as someone who's been covering politics for decades, what are you thinking is going to happen in the midterms?
I mean, look, in the current political environment, so much can change so quickly. Like, let's issue the standard disclaimer here. But like ABC News just put out a poll that had Republicans' advantage on the generic ballot, right, of +11.
Holy crap! Okay.
And in 2010, Republicans on the generic ballot had a +7. 2010 was the worst electoral defeat for a major electoral party since the end of World War II.
Okay.
Like, no one has any conception of what a +11 election might possibly look like, But, on the caveats here are that even in the last decade, polls have gotten substantially worse. Yes. And it's hard to put too much, faith in any of this sort of thing. But obviously, one thing I will say, so I live in Virginia. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, Northern Virginia, suburb of DC, and It blew my mind because this neighborhood is about 75-25 Democratic Republican. And my wife and I were like telling ourselves, no, well, this can't possibly be a thing. Virginia hasn't elected a statewide Republican in over a decade. And in our neighborhood, which is overwhelmingly Democratic, Glenn Youngkin signs outnumbered Terry McAuliffe signs 3-1. I
Holy
mean,
crap. And
it
Terry
was,
McAuliffe is hardly some kind of radical loon.
no, he'd previously been governor.
Yeah, right. Everyone knew him. Yeah.
Everyone knew him. I mean, but it was absolutely bananas. And I think the Democratic Party's made a huge miscalculation, at least in this term, which is to say that they're very focused, and I should say the people that drive the party have the mindset and are keyed into the activists of the urban progressive variety, right?
Yeah.
And that's the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, San Francisco. But the reality is where I live in the Virginia suburbs, these people are very socially liberal. They're very, dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, but they're not progressives. If you do anything to mess with their property values or their kids' ability to get into a top-tier college, then God have mercy on your soul. And that's exactly what happened, I think, in Virginia. I mean, and I think that's where a lot of the country is right now.
And it's also not a matter of getting them to vote Republican, which many of them will never do, even at gunpoint. But it is not that hard to get them to sit on their hands. That's what people don't realize.
That is a huge part of it. Certainly, obviously, there are voting blocks that were been much more sort of the lower class Democratic voting blocks. Like African American voters and things like. Well, I don't mean lower class, but I'm saying people that tend to be economically disadvantaged. Democratic voters tend to be much more inclined to sit on the sidelines in an environment like this. And and then that's, I think, a big reason why they're screaming racism all the time. They've got to motivate certain ethnic voting bases. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just tell you what I've seen in my neighborhood, and which is say a lot of the other thing is I'm on a school board of a private school in Virginia. So for the past 2 years, I have been dealing with parents who are desperate to flee public schools.
Wow.
And again, I live in one of the per capita richest places in the United States, and the public schools are a disaster.
No one likes to show off, Mark.
No. No, the reason why it's the wealthiest area is not because there are tons of millionaires, but it's because they're all federal workers, right?
Yeah.
130 grand a year plus times 2 for a dual income household, and you're all of a sudden up there. But I mean that's a whole other story about Virginia. But yeah, I really think that the Democratic Party is culturally out on a limb right now.
I am surprised and delighted that Kamala Harris, who I think is just an awful person in many ways, given my feelings toward the police, had a record low approval rating when she hasn't even been doing anything.
It's insane. Like I saw one poll recently that her approval rating was 28%.
Yeah, how is that even possible? She just sits there and looks pretty. She's very charismatic looking, at least.
There's something about her, and like I think this was also true of Hillary Clinton. Like, I don't even know, you can call it sexist, you can call whatever you want, but like Hillary Clinton reminded people of like every awful like middle school vice principal that they'd ever encountered. And Kamala kind of has something similar to that, where there's just like a particular phoniness. The other thing is just not a lot of substance there. I can't remember. She was asked recently, I don't know if you saw this, she was leaving some diplomatic thing in Europe, and she was asked about Russia, amassing forces on the border of the Ukraine. She's like, I can't talk about classified information.
Wait, seriously? I didn't see this.
Literally, that was her response.
She didn't start laughing for no reason.
Well, that's her typical response. But like, I was just stunned. And what was weird is like the press didn't like shoot back like, what are you talking about? Anything. They were just like, oh, okay, well, thanks. You have a nice time. And I'm just like, I've done that kind of reporting before where you have to shove a microphone in someone's face in a scrum or whatever. And I was just shocked. I mean, like it was such a garbage answer, and it was so obviously like flailing, but like, that's who she is. There's no there. There just isn't.
Have you heard any gossip? And of course, this is gossip, so unsubstantiated, about what I've been hearing about there being basically open warfare in the White House between Team Biden and Team Pork?
Well, I heard all the gossip, but then of course that all broke out in the open with that recent CNN story, right? I mean, it's pretty undeniable at this point in time that that's exactly what's happening.
Well, can you tell people what you heard?
So there was a CNN story recently. I mean, I'd heard stuff about this, forever. So obviously Kamala signed on with Joe as vice president. As vice president under Joe Biden, and Joe Biden is Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And so obviously everyone is not thinking she's not thinking 7 years from now. She's thinking, 3 years from now in terms of, when she gets to run. And so the White House has been very careful about putting Kamala in situations where she doesn't overshadow Joe Biden. Because, Biden is so addled and, Biden must appear presidential. At the same time, I mean, she's such a disaster on her own. Like, I don't know how you could possibly, put the two of them in the room and not have it be like a force multiplier for stupid. But that's so that there was all this tension. And then they put Kamala in charge of the border at the time when, when it still is a rolling disaster. But I mean, it's just like maybe the most politically hot and disastrous aspect of the Biden administration. They're like, oh, it's Kamala's problem. And Kamala basically made no secret of telling the White House to sit and spin. Like, I'm not going down to the border and pretending to like take command of this disaster. And so there's been this like ongoing tension. And then just a week or two ago, the White House the CNN put out this story about detailing all this backstabbing between the White House and the vice president's office. And this, of course, immediately responded with a tweet from Jen Psaki saying, Kamala's wonderful, and I don't know why anyone would think that she's not wonderful. And that tweet just like made everyone think, oh my gosh, things are worse than we thought.
I know.
Right?
If the White House press secretary says everything is fine and there's no reason to believe otherwise, you run for the hills, because that means it's this disaster time.
And so now we're in this situation where, nobody knows what's going on. And then there's this other weird part of the mix, which is that it's actually like a triumvirate of awfulness when the Pete Buttigieg's people are basically like openly talking about leveraging his tenure as Secretary of Transportation, proceeding over a major logistics crisis, as being his big springboard for the White House in 2024. And it's just, it's such a comedy of errors. And this is all happening in a backdrop of where the president of the United States has an approval rating of 38%. Kamala has an approval rating of 28%. No one knows who Pete Buttigieg is. And, unless things change dramatically, Republicans are going to have a huge advantage, both in the midterms and the presidential election coming up. So it's Veep all the way around, basically.
Mark, we're running out of time.
Yes.
What has been your favorite part of this interview?
My favorite part of this interview. My gosh. Wow. Is this some sort of like midwit detection device? Is that what this is about?
This is just my closing question. I'll ask it again. Mark, we're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
Well, my favorite part of this interview was probably when you put me on the spot for insulting you inadvertently and making me squirm.
You are welcome.